Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Arabic History Podcast. I'm your host, Talha Hassan, a first year PhD student at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. In our previous interview with Dr. Kevin Blankenship about the philosopher-poet Al-Ma'arri, we learnt Al-Ma'arri's works often had allusions to the workings of celestial objects, which he said required more research. From my recent viewing of the Netflix series Rise of Empires, the Ottomans, we learnt how the influence of heavenly motions was part and parcel of people's lives. I'm very excited to have with me today a world authority on matters astrological, esoteric, and magic in the Islamicate to give an introduction to Islamicate astrology, themes, works, and practitioners, Dr. Liana Saif. Dr. Saif is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Warburg Institute, London. Welcome, Dr. Saif.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to meet you, albeit virtually. And I'm happy to have this opportunity during these times. After all, what better escape than to the stars? So let's do this.
First, let's try to get a sense of what we are dealing with when we speak about Islamic astrology, and let us define terms. We have ilm al-falak, observation of orbits for want of a better translation, and ilm al-nujum, knowledge of stars for want of a better translation. We also have a host of other terms like magic, esotericism, and so on. How do they relate to each other, and what do we mean by Islamic astrology? And also, we moderns tend to be ignorant about the basic workings of the moon, planets, and stars. So set a picture for us on that too.
Sure. Let's first start with what astrology meant in the sources that I deal with, which are medieval sources around the 8th century to the 12th century, roughly. So astrology in its most basic sense is relating celestial phenomena to terrestrial events. And this was known as ilm ahkam al-nujum, so literally the science of the judgments of the stars. And it's concerned with judgments, it's concerned with quality of influence. Its quantitative sister, astronomy, was known as ilm al-hay'a, so literally the science of conditions, again, not the most accurate translation. But it's important to realize that they were not perceived as separate, but two sides of the same coin, and that coin is called ilm al-nujum, literally the science of the stars. You can also count astrology as one of the occult sciences, al-ulum al-khafiyya, in Arabic, which include magic, divination, and alchemy. But occult here simply refers to the influences and causes that are hidden from the immediate senses, and that can be utilized for the management of life, which is why medicine is actually placed with the occult sciences by someone like Ibn Sina, considering them a secondary sciences in his Risala fil Ulum al-Aqliya. And so do Ikhwan al-Safa in the 10th century. And this is because like magic and astrology, medicine looks into the hidden causes behind symptoms and signs and effects. So with that in mind, it starts making sense why medicine and astrology were married, and medical astrology was also practiced. So what do we mean by Islamic? So in my research, I am not concerned so much with the level where paradigms of orthodoxy were generated and maintained by ulama, jurists, etc. It's important, but that's not what I focus on, because I am concerned with the intellectual and social realities on the level where the formal theological discourse, which include discussion on the permissibility of astrology, how that filters down a little bit. And it is where this discourse and its various positions of orthodoxy become more flexible. So Islamic in itself becomes more flexible and becomes inclusive of non-Muslim agents. So this is the social intellectual level where astrologers, mages, diviners, alchemists, physicians, and natural philosophers think and work, whether with patrons or without patrons. But it is important to remember that this flexibility is also necessitated by these groups themselves, since after all, these were crafts and professions and people made a living with them. And We know that astrology was a regulated profession from the Hisba sources, so the law enforcement and civil regulation sources. And we also know from the Mihna sources, profession sources, which do include texts dedicated to astrologers. Also, part of that Islamic setting is the fact that to be noted and sponsored by a caliph was the dream. There is a potential for social mobility in astrology, but that does not mean that it was completely accepted or uncensored. However, the occasions where we do have censorship of astrology are exceptions, and I can give you an example of that. For example, in Al-Andalus, when Al-Mansur ascended to power, astrology actually began to be censored due to the strict position on its permissibility, but also to assert his legitimacy of power with the support of the religious scholars. He goes as far as to actually burn books on astrology from Al-Hakam II library. But as I said, these stories are exceptions to the rule. Astrology provided astrologers a good way of being mobile socially and financially. So, for example, I'll give you a story about Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, the Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, who sought the caliph to make money, literally. So we know from Nishwar al-Muhadara wa Ahbar al-Mudakara by al-Tanukhi that Abu Ma'shar and his companion al-Buhtari were suffering from financial difficulties. So to improve their situation, they decided to gain favor with Al-Mu'taz, who was at that time incarcerated. Abu Ma'shar predicted that Al-Mu'taz would eventually become a caliph. When his prediction was realized, the new caliph assigned him an allowance of 100 dinars per month, gave him 30 dinars worth real estate, and bestowed upon him many gifts. In addition, he made him chief of astrologers at court. And so with gaining favor with caliphs and sultans, astrologers became political consultants too, as well as celebrities. So this is the kind of setting that I have in mind when I think Islamic astrology. And this scene is for me Islamic, but a bit through and a bit beyond the formal positions on permissibility, and more on the level of intellectual and vocational practices of the occult sciences. So to set the astrological scene a little bit, the typical worldview of astrologers consists of a geocentric universe. Earth at the center, then the moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Then the sphere of the fixed stars. The wandering stars, i.e. the planets, move across the constellations on the ninth sphere, creating various and complicated configuration with them and creating aspects with all other planets. All these signify things pertaining to the lives of individuals, communities, and dynasties. So star scientists were not just idle observers. They were seeing round, celestial, huge bodies moving and interacting with the Earth. So naturally, they had questions about the nature of this motion. So how are these things moving? Were they moved by something, or are they self-moving? If they were self-moving, then how? Are they alive and moved by their souls, or is it a mechanical process? So astrologers were wondering about the nature of celestial motion, but also they were wondering about how celestial motion caused change in the terrestrial world. In other words, action at a distance. So they were concerned with action at a distance, especially that Aristotle said that that's not possible. So was it the heat from the friction of the spheres that caused these influences? What are the rays of the stars? How does ether fit in? How do the elements react to astral influences? And these questions place astrology firmly within the field of natural philosophy, since these questions belong to natural philosophy. So it is not an exaggeration to say that the considerable influx of astrological texts alongside medical text as a result of the patronized wide translation activities in the Abbasid period. Yeah, it's not an exaggeration to say that this made the human body, or these sciences made the human body, which is the microcosm, and the cosmos, the macrocosm, made them knowable. So naturally, the ramification of this is quite significant to the lives of individuals and society. We can know the body, we can know the cosmos, And this was helped by this influx of astrological, medical, and texts on a natural philosophy, whether it was Greek or Persian. So yes, there was a paradigm shift due to our knowledge of signs, whether these signs were signs in heaven, signs in nature, or signs in the body. So, but what Islamic astrology actually did, it did not just receive this knowledge and accepted it. It engaged with it. And in fact, it matured further, or as David Pingree would say, it amplified its Greek and Persian antecedents by explicitly, and this is important, by explicitly philosophizing astrology and to a large degree, astrologizing philosophy in an unprecedented systematic way. And on top of all of this, astral narratives can now tell political stories. It is in this context that we can understand the lore on the foundation of the new capital, Baghdad. The millenarian and messianic ambitions of the Abbasids were inscribed, so to speak, on these foundations, and also on the stars, on the heavens. The capital is said, the capital was inaugurated in Rabi' al-Awwal, 145 Hijri. So that's July 762. It was laid out on astrological principles, including a quadruple system corresponding to the cardinal points, and possibly a hexagonal scheme that identified with many septenary systems in the ancient world, including the 7 planets. But also the crème de la crème of astrologers were there. Omar al-Faruq Khan al-Tabari, al-Fazari, Nawbakht, al-Mashallah. So Baghdad has now become the seat of Abbasid theopolitical power, legitimated by the celestial world itself, especially Jupiter, because Jupiter represents eminence, wisdom, rulership, and is extremely beneficial. So in a way, it was the city of Jupiter. So the horoscope data that we know came from the geographer Al-Yaqubi in the 9th century and Al-Biruni in the 11th. But the story also goes that the city of Shiraz was rebuilt in 693 when Virgo was in the ascendant, as told by the 14th century geographer Al-Mustawfi in Nizhat al-Qulub. And Al-Maqrizi as well in the 15th century tells us that Cairo was built with the sun and the moon in their exaltation. That is, the sun was in Aries and the moon was in Taurus. And so that should give a very general idea about the worldview of astrologers, hopefully, in these periods.
Astrology as a subject for people of Islamic and Islamicate ecumene is said to have begun after the conquest of Hellenistic Egypt. You've already told us something about it. Tell us more about this process and the beginnings of astrology as a science. And surely there was also a pre-Islamic Arabian legacy too.
Sure. So as many things go, we can always start with Bilad al-Rafidain, Mesopotamia. So I will be brief, but it's important to understand this inheritance to understand properly what Islamic astrology actually means. So from what I understand, something different than what we now know from Greek and Islamic astrology was going on in Mesopotamia. There we have celestial omens whereby the gods communicated, usually to the king, the current and future state of things. It was a divinatory practice. So the formula is a simple protasis and apodosis. A special importance is given to the moon and included as atmospheric phenomena. Like rainbows, like the clouds. However, there were also forms of what scholars describe as proto-horoscopes, but it's not so clear how to interpret them. And these horoscopes, the ones that survive, give little information. So from Mesopotamia to Greek astrology, the science of astrology that we know now, i.e. Ilm al-Nujum, developed in the late 2nd and early 1st century BC. It was based on predictions by means of an astrological chart of a person's moment of birth, or conception, but that's a whole can of worms we're not going to get into now. And this kind of astrology, the one based on the natal chart, is called genethliology. Genethliology. I think I said it right. So it borrowed a lot from Mesopotamian celestial omens, but also from Egypt. And it was adapted to determine the best times to undertake all kinds of action. And when it was adapted like that, it became Catarchic astrology. So Greek astrology, however, borrowed techniques developed in India, namely interrogational astrology, which itself was based on Greek Catarchic astrology. So interrogational astrology is when you posit questions and you want to find their answers from the stars. So not necessarily just the natal charts. So it also incorporated what is referred to as historical astrology, which was actually developed in Sasanian Iran on the basis of Greek genethliology. And this is important, we'll get back to it. But Greek astrology in general is set in the more familiar Aristotelian geocentric universe. And that some planets are benefic, others are malefic. But this is probably from Babylonian astral sciences, the malefic and benefic influence of the stars. But then we also have Indian astrology. As some have shown, including David Pingree, Babylonian astral sciences influence in Indian astral sciences. And then Indian astrology incorporated a lot of Hellenistic astronomy and astrology, as attested by the large presence of technical terms that are basically transliteration from Greek. But to return back to Sasanian astrology a little bit, unfortunately, nothing substantial survived in Middle Persian. The most famous element of Sasanian astrology, however, is the horoscope of Gaimard, and also the horoscope of the world, which we can find in the 9th century Bundashan. What we do know about Sasanian astrology came from early medieval Arabic translations and reference to it in Arabic works. And from these, we notice two elements that become quite characteristic of Sasanian astrology, and that's historical astrology and the doctrine of the Great Conjunction. To keep it short, historical astrology is the branch of astrology that deals with political and religious history by using the conjunctions of superior planets, particularly Saturn and Jupiter. This kind of astrology had been developed in Sasanian and Persia on the basis of the Indian system of Yuga. The Book of Religions and Dynasties that is attributed to Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi in the 9th century is the most complete surviving work that actually gives us the systematic account of the full range of methodology for historical astrology. And this becomes quite definitive also of Islamic or Islamicate astrology. So early Abbasid astrology and astronomy was largely then Sasanian and Greek, with entangled Egyptian and Indian elements, but yet largely Greek and Persian. Almost all of the astrologers in the 8th and 9th centuries were Persians. So you have Nawabacht, who was a Zoroastrian astrologer, worked for Al-Mansur, who converted to Islam. And then, mashallah, a Persian Jew from Basra, Sahel ibn Bishr, a Jew who worked in Khurasan, and of course, Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi. And what astrologers of this era did is establish astrology as a natural science with a comprehensive theory and a systematic content, more than anything before. So here we have a new phase in the codification of astrology, and very important, which cannot be overestimated, the emergence of user-friendly astrological books. Introductions such as those by Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi and al-Qabisi, because they amplified the status of astrology. They provided textbooks, sources for astrologers to use, and astrologers have been using them till this day. So the other thing that can also be emphasized is that Sasanian historical astrology or big events astrology was definitely mobilized to legitimize Islamic dynasties, including the Abbasid. So this is, again, we're back in the Islamic context. So the other thing you asked is if there were local Arabic folk practices, right?
Right, whether there was like a pre-Islamic Arabian legacy as well
Right.
within the peninsula.
Sure. So let's talk about Arabic quote-unquote folk astronomy or astral sciences. Typical genres that we have are the anwa and azmina books. Calendars also existed, and some almanacs also existed. Books on the first sighting of the lunar crescent, prayer times, and the qibla. So let's focus a little bit on the anwa because that's particularly fascinating, at least for me. So we have anwa books which deal mainly with atmospheric and celestial phenomena. So rising and settings of specific stars and groups of stars indicate the times of rain, wind, heat, and cold. And so they were used a lot to manage agriculture. Frequently, they also include a presentation of the lunar mansions and the description of their use for calendrical and timekeeping purposes. These works were complemented by proverbs, poems, and commentaries that are related to astronomical phenomena and other topics. An early example of this is Kitab al-Anwa by Ibn Qutayba, who flourished in Iraq and died in 889. And this is one of the major sources that we use for knowledge about Anwa literature. Sometimes Anwa books comprise astrological data. For example, in the one written by Ahmad bin Faris called Al-Mukhtasar min al-Anwa. So you have that, you have the Anwa, but also astrological practices thrived in local communities whose religion centered on planetary reverence and rituals. Later Arabic sources refer to these groups as Sabians, but it's a messy term, so let's not get there. But among these communities are the people of Harran and their planetary temples. And one of the, if not the most famous Harranian, quote-unquote, Sabian, is the astronomer, astrologer, and mage Thabit ibn Qurra, who died in 901. His religion and cultural background arguably had a distinct advantage in the cosmopolitan milieu where astrology was central, fashionable, and lucrative. We can add to this what Ahmad Jalad has shown. He has shown a Sapphitic inscription with the names of the ecliptic constellations, the zodiac, that were used to reckon time with. And he suggests that the ancient Arabian zodiac has roots that go back all the way to Babylon. Almost all knowledge of this ancient tradition seems to have been lost by the so-called classical Islamic period. In any case, it's my opinion that the direct influence of such groups like the Harranians or the Sabians, quote unquote, it was more in the practice of astral magic than directly to astrology.
So let's now turn to some people and some personalities, the stars of the study of the stars. With the development of this subject, we have a host of names and characters, some of whom you have mentioned. MashaAllah, Ibn Athari, the Persian Jewish astrologer who lived in Baghdad during the reign of the Caliphs Al-Ma'mun and Al-Mansur, dying in 815 Common Era. We have someone like Sahal ibn Bishr, the Syriac Christian who served as a court astrologer, dying in 845 Common Era. Why don't you tell us about some of these more seminal figures and their works, influences, and legacy within this long Abbasid era until the 15th century?
Sure. There's a lot of them. And we don't know that much about the personal lives of many of these astrologers. And we know which caliphs, who they worked with, etc. But if it's okay with you, like, I would like to focus on my favorite astrologers, if that's okay with you. And by my favorite astrologers in the plural, I will be focusing a little bit on Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, who I've written on, and we know more about him than some others in that period. So if it's okay, I'll start talking about this guy. So Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, as many know, his influence was far-reaching. And his works actually exemplify this impulse that I talked about earlier to systematize and philosophize astrology. He was born in Balkh, possibly in 787, and he died also possibly in 886. We know these dates from an anonymous horoscope in Kitab Tahawil Sinil Mawalid, so the book on the revolutions of the years of nativity. And we also know the death date from Al-Nadim's Fihrist. What is really cool about Abu Ma'shar, other than his many surviving books, is that many fascinating anecdotes about him that show him in that historical Islamic context that I talked about today. I've already told you the story about how he dealt with his own financial problems. But one of the most interesting sources is the diaries of his pupil Abu Sa'id Shadan. It's called Al-Mudhakarat. And I would like to tell you one of my favorite stories. Is that okay? So once upon a time, Abu Ma'shar was in a khan, a caravanserai, in one of the villages of Rai. There he met a man with whom he found solace in conversation. The man figured out that Abu Ma'shar was an astrologer, so he asked him about what the moon may be indicating regarding the day of traveling, regarding their departure. And Abu Ma'shar recommends that they stay put the day after because the moon is in a square aspect with Mars. That's not good. So they both take permission to stay in the khan, and those who run it accept in return for some animal feed. So Abu Ma'shar and his friend warn the people of the caravan about it, and they didn't listen and went on to actually ridicule Abu Ma'shar and his new friend. So instead they leave. Abu Ma'shar panics. He hits the roof of the khan, does his calculations, and finds that the ascendant is Taurus and the moon is in Leo. And so he exclaimed out loud, Allah, Allah fi anfusikum, by God, fear for your souls, but to no avail. So Abu Ma'shar turns back and says to the guy working there, they shall perish, they shall perish. But he can do nothing. So they sit down and they eat, when suddenly some members of this caravan walk in, wounded and completely messed up. Turns out they were attacked by bandits and some of them were killed. And when they see Abu Ma'shar, they throw stones at him and beat him up with sticks. And more or less they say, like, Oi, Abu Ma'shar, you are a mage, a sahir. You killed us and violated our caravan. And they continue hitting him, but he eventually manages to escape, making a vow, never to speak to commoners and non-experts on the subject of astrology. And so in texts like this, you get an idea a little bit about the astrologer beyond just the books, beyond just the philosophy of astrology. And so, yeah, Abu Ma'shar, he's really cool. I'm also a big fan of Al-Qabisi, who was known in Latin as Al-Qabitius as well, because he also wrote a very influential, very user-friendly introduction to astrology. So generally, a fan of astrologers who make it easier for others. And it seems to me that these astrologers, especially of the Abbasid period, did exactly that. They made it easier for a lot of people to this day.
And as we come to the end, what has been the reception and legacy of these works and practices, both within and beyond the Islamicate ecumene?
I mean, that's a subject that can fill another podcast interview. But within the Islamic world ecumene, it's exactly what I said. You know, astrology became part and parcel of politics, of just the worldview of people. And it was practiced in the streets, and it was practiced in the courts. And these introductions, madakhil, were blockbusters. And so if you read Al-Fihris, if you read Tarikh Ibn Khaldun, Muqaddimat Ibn Khaldun, becomes very clear that these texts became part of the canon of natural philosophy. And because of this, when these texts were translated and received in the Latin, quote unquote, West, it was that aspect that was so attractive, because in the 12th century Europe, the 12th century Renaissance, as it is called, texts of Abu Ma'shar and other astrologers started to get translated in the schools of Paris and the school of Chartres. And it's not an exaggeration to say that the astrological text and the medical text developed the science known as physica. And physica was basically about knowing the universe, knowing the human body, and knowing the cosmos. And these Arabic texts provided that. But also it legitimated astrology. It presented astrology not as collaborating with demons or something dodgy like that, but it was natural philosophy, physica. And so by the time they get to the Renaissance, the European Renaissance, these texts were hot currency. They were widely read. For example, Abu Ma'shar was translated twice in the 12th century and printed a lot after that. And also other reasons, not just the natural philosophy, but also that it was user-friendly. It made it easier for people to practice it. The rules are clear, the instructions are clear, and it comes with philosophical justifications. So in a context where these things were more censored than in the Islamic context, that was very precious. And I think that's what was behind the deep perception and impact of Islamic astrology. But there's a lot more to be said. I mean, I would like to learn more about Islamic astrology beyond just the Arabic or Persian or European context. I would like to encourage research to look at that influence globally, in different places, in different areas, rather than just these limits. And I hope more people do that.
And where are some places, some secondary sources that interested listeners can look at to learn more?
There is a lot in terms of work. David Pingree, the late David Pingree, has written a lot on that subject. And for anyone who's interested about this melange of influences within Islamic astrology, the Mesopotamian, the Egyptian, the Indian, the Persian, then the works of David Pingree are a good place to start. Professor Charles Burnett at the Warburg Institute wrote so much about this as well. Also, we have a lot of younger scholars who are writing about astrology, Ottoman astrology, but also there is a project called the Astra Project, historical research on astrological techniques and practices. And the research teams have scholars who've been working in astrology for a long time. And the scientific advisors include many of the scholars that I've just mentioned. And it's a really good resource and a really cool project. So, so that's called, again, the Astra Project. Yeah, they have a website with lectures, meetings, publication, resources, training, and outreach. So I recommend anyone who's interested to take a look there. Okay, so there's a project at the University of Erlangen in Germany called Fate, Freedom, and Prognostication, Strategies for Coping with the Future in East Asia and Europe, which also have the publications and videos and research resources and a bibliography as well. Hopefully this year, a book called The Islamic and Occult Sciences in Theory and Practice, edited by myself, Francesca Leoni, Matthew Melvin Kushki, and Farouk Yahya, which contains articles on astrology. So keep an eye on that. And currently there is a rise in research interested on the occult sciences. So I think everyone should keep an eye for that as well.
And you're too modest to mention your own academia page where people can also find your prolific output as well.
Oh, so I have an account on academia.edu where I do put as many articles and works that I can on there. And also I have a Twitter account for my current project, which is translating a magic text called Ghayat al-Hakim, 10th century text. But I do post a lot about projects related to astrology as well. And I put a lot of sources on there. So if anyone is interested, they can check that. But the Twitter account is not Liana Saif. It's Ghayat al-Hakim, and the handle is Maslama Q.
Which brings us nicely to our final question. So you have an NC conference scheduled for May, European Network for the Study of Islamic Esotericism. Tell us about that. And also, I think you alluded to some of your current projects. So tell some things to excite our listeners about what to expect in the near future.
Sure. NC is the European Network for the Study of Islamic Esotericism, and it is a thematic network as part of ESWI, which is the European Society for the Study of quote-unquote Western Esotericism, and aims to bridge the gap between the study of Islamic esotericism and the study of esotericism in the West. And it's founded by Mark Sedgwick and other scholars. There's a blog where we put all the news and all new project, and that's the NC blog, blog.nc.site. And that's where we put also all the calls for papers for any conferences that we organize. And there is currently a call for paper for a conference on Islamic esotericism in global context. So all the details are there. It's going to take place at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. The deadline for submission is the 1st of May 2020. But if anyone's interested, they can take a look and then send us an abstract. My main project right now is on Jabir ibn Hayyan, more specifically an understudied text on magic by Jabir ibn Hayyan called, known as Kitab al-Bahth, but I argue that it's actually called Kitab al-Mukhab. And this is a project that is part of a collaboration between the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium and the Warburg Institute in London. This project is called The Origin and Early Development of Philosophy in 10th Century Al-Andalus, the Impact of Ill-Defined Materials and Channels of Transmission. It's very heavy on the occult sciences and esoteric currents and trends in Al-Andalus. And these are basically my major projects right now.
It just leaves me to thank you for being our guest, and it was great speaking to you. And we hope to have you back on soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a lot of fun. Thank you.